In this demo, I'm going to show you how to attach a bias facing with horsehair braid inside of it to a hem of a garment that's been underlined. So let's first talk about underlining our garment. So there's underlining and then there's lining. There's a difference between the two. Lining a garment is like actually a whole separate garment inside of a garment, okay? And it finishes the inside of a garment, so when the person looks inside, it looks nice and clean. Underlining a garment is actually kind of changing the nature of your fabric. You're going to be, when you underline something, you back your fabric with another fabric, okay? So here, for example, is a piece of muslin, okay? The right side has the lines on it, and then here's the wrong side without it. There's a couple things that underlining does for us. For example, right now, you can probably see the grid of this table through this fabric, okay? If you want to change the nature of your fabric and so it's a little more durable or so you can't see through it, then you can underline it, okay? So if you have a fabric that maybe is a little too flimsy but you really like it and you want to make it more durable or give it more structure, then you should underline it. If you want to make it so you can't see through your fabric, then you can underline it as well. So I have this piece of lining material here. I'll just put it underneath this piece of muslin, like so, okay? And now you can no longer see the grid underneath my muslin, okay? Because I've underlined it or backed it with this other fabric, all right? You can also change the color of your fabric. For example, if you wanted to, if you had like a white fabric and you wanted to give it like a pinkish hue, you could underline it with a bright pink fabric, and then that white fabric that was on top, your fashion fabric, that pink hue would shine through, giving kind of a pink glow. All right. Another reason we underline is for finishing purposes. Okay. So when I go ahead and attach my hem to this, and I flip this over and do all the handwork, when I do the handwork, I'll just catch the underlining layer, okay, with my stitches. That way, when I flip it around, I won't see any of those stitches coming through to my fashion fabric on the outside, and will look nice and clean. All right. So when you cut your underlining out, you really want to cut it out at the same time as your fashion fabric, and you would layer them all together, put the pattern on top, pin it, and cut it out. So I've underlined now this piece of fabric. I'm going to quickly pin baste around the edges so they stay together. Okay, there we go. And I'm going to do some diagonal basting stitches as well through this, just so it holds them together. So when you're sewing on it, you really want, once you've underlined your fabric, you consider the underlining and the fashion fabric that you underlined one piece of fabric. And basting them together will help hold the two fabrics together so they are like one piece of fabric, okay? So I'm going to do some quick diagonal basting stitches. I'll do 3 rows. These stitches should not be small. You want to be about 2 to 3 inches because these will be pulled out when the garment is complete. And your thread will catch everything as you do it. Okay, now it's basted. You can see both sides. All right, so there we go. Now we're ready to start working on our hem. Okay, for this hem, we're going to add a bias facing to create the hem, and we're going to put a piece of horsehair braid inside that bias facing to give it a little more body at the hem, and give that hem a little more ability to kind of puff out and hold the shape and structure of the bottom of the dress. Okay, so the first thing you need to do, in this case, I'm using a 1-inch wide horsehair braid. Okay, so we have 1 inch wide. So what I did is I cut a 3-inch wide bias strip of fabric. All right. First thing we need to do is press this in half with our iron lengthwise. So let's go ahead and press that. Okay, so let's go ahead and press this in half. I'm just going to fold it in half lengthwise and press as I go. Be careful not to curve it or pull on it too much. It is biased, so it is pretty stretchy and make sure you're lining up the two cut edges as you press it. Alright, there it is. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to sew the horsehair braid into this bias. Okay, so I'm going to open up my piece of bias. Here's the crease of it, or the center of it. I'm going to take my horsehair braid and I'm going to lay it right in there. Now, if you're using a much longer piece of bias and horsehair braid, you're not going to be able to just open up and lay it in. As you feed it into the sewing machine, you'll have to kind of wedge your horsehair braid in between the layers as you stitch it, which I'm going to do right now. So let's go over to the sewing machine and stitch this horsehair braid into the bias. Alright, here we are at the sewing machine. We're now going to stitch our horsehair braid into this bias. So we're going to open up the bias and just wedge the horsehair braid in there. And before I start sewing, I'm going to change my foot to a zipper foot, because I want to get nice and close to that bias when I stitch. Alright, now I can go ahead and stitch this. So now I'm going to tuck my horsehair braid into the bias in between both layers, and I'm going to stitch right on the edge here. I'm going to run the edge of my foot along the edge of that horsehair braid. I don't want to catch the horsehair braid. I just want to guide my zipper foot, or the edge of my foot right here, okay, along the edge of this, and stitch this bias closed around the horsehair braid. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll line it up. Now this horsehair braid is pretty flat, so it can be a little difficult to hold this foot right on the edge. Just do your best. You should be able to feel with your finger in front of the foot where that ridge is, and just kind of guide it as you go. Let's see, here's the edge of my... You can see in there, there's my horsehair braid sandwiched in between the two layers of bias. Okay, here it is on this side. Cut that off so it's even. Alright, there it is. So now I have a piece of bias with horsehair braid in it. Now we can go ahead and attach this to the hem of our garment. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we're ready to attach our bias facing to the hem of our garment. Okay, so here's our garment. Here's the right side of it. We're going to go ahead and attach this to it. Here's the hem of the garment. Now, you notice I have a little less than a ½ inch of seam allowance here, and that's fine. We're going to go ahead and say we have a ½ inch seam allowance on this. All right, and what we'll do is we'll line up the cut edge of this with the ½ inch marking on the sewing machine, and then we'll line up this stitching here with the needle, and then that way it will be stitched on right at a ½ inch. Okay, so again, we're going to apply this to the right side. We're going to have the seam allowance facing down towards the hem, and right now the facing is facing up towards the top of the garment. So let's go to the sewing machine and do that. Alright, we're at the machine now. We want to keep our zipper foot on for this, because again, we want to stitch nice and close to this horsehair braid. And let's go ahead and line up this cut edge, or the hem of our garment, with whatever our prescribed seam allowance is. In this case, it's a ½ inch. So that's my line right there. And then I'm going to line up the stitching of my facing, of this bias facing, with my needle. Okay, and I'll just place that down. Nice and close. There we are. Alright, now we can go ahead and stitch these on. Back tack, beginning and end. There we go. Alright, again, I'm just keeping this cut edge of my garment lined up with my ½ inch mark, and the stitching lined up with the needle as I go. And there we are. Okay, There it is sewn on. Now what we're going to do, so eventually this is going to flip and turn to the inside of the garment and be on the inside like that. So right side, inside. Okay. But what we want to do first is understitch this. Okay, this will give it a much nicer, cleaner edge. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure all the seam allowance on the inside here, so the seam allowance of the facing and of the garment hem, okay, is facing down towards the hem. All right, and then I'm going to lay my bias facing right over top of that, like that, so it's facing down as well. And then I want to stitch about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam that I just have sewn, okay? And I'm going to keep my needle nice and close to that edge, and as I stitch, I'm going to pull the garment to the left, and I'm going to pull my bias facing to the right, so I'm pulling them away from each other. So let's go ahead and do that. So what this will do, it will give it a nice clean finish when I turn this to the inside. All right, so let's go ahead and understitch this. I'm staying nice and close to that edge. There we go. And now it's been understitched. All right, let's go ahead and go back to our cutting table. All right, here we are. We've understitched this. Now we can flip it to the wrong side. So there's the wrong side. We'll flip this in like so. And now we can hand tack this to the garment. Okay, so let's go ahead and thread up a needle, some thread. Okay, so here's the hem of my garment. Here's the bias facing. We're going to flip it in. And we're going to do a hidden slip stitch here, okay? Now, when we sew this, we want to make sure that we don't flip it back and we pull too much fashion fabric with it. We're going to push this down right to the edge and give it a nice clean finish here, all right? And you notice on the right side, okay, it'll look nice and flat. So we're going to do a hidden slip stitch. I'm just going to start by tacking or anchoring my thread down to the inside of this hem, just so it doesn't go anywhere. There we go. Now, let's flip this over, and again, we want to press this bias facing down as far as we can. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here behind, and I'm going to go travel down the crease of this hem and then come up, like so. The thread will catch on everything. And then wherever I came up, I just want to catch a little bit of just the underlining, this red layer. I don't want to go through to the fashion fabric. And then I'm going to go right back in to that crease, travel about 1/2 inch, and come back up. And I'm going to repeat the process. So I'll catch again just a little bit of that underlining, carefully not catching any of the fashion fabric. Go back, travel down the crease of that facing, come back up. Okay, as I'm doing this, I'm pushing the facing down to the edge, so I'm making sure I'm not getting pulling any of this fashion fabric back, but it's nice and close to the edge. There should only be about 1/16 of an inch of the fashion fabric coming to the back side. Now, if you're doing this correctly, you shouldn't see any stitches on the right side of the fabric. So, I've taken about 5 or 6 stitches so far. If I turn it around, you can see there's no black on this side. That means I'm just catching my underlining and I'm not catching through to the fashion fabric, and that's what we want. So we'll quickly stitch this the rest of the way. Just make a loop, go through it twice. Oops. And there we go. Okay, so there it is. It's all hand stitched up. And if you did your invisible slip stitch correctly, you shouldn't be able to really see your stitches at all. And you would obviously be using thread that matches your fabric as well. Okay, so that's the wrong side of it. And then here's what the right side looks like. Okay, and again, this will give your hem a lot of body. You can see here how much it stands out. Okay, and kind of keeps its shape. All right, so there it is. So that's a bias facing with horsehair braid. You can also do this without the horsehair braid inside. You just wouldn't have as much structure, but still nice finish. And also think about, you could do this bias facing or the bias facing with horsehair braid in it. You could do that many places on your garment. You could do it on a neckline of a sleeveless strapless garment. You could do it at the hem of a sleeve. You know, wherever you want to give it a little more shape, a little more structure, you can do that. Okay? So there it is, complete.